Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into this video on logic modeling brought to you by CIS National. My name is Morgan Bale and joining me is Betty Lee and Eamon Khan. We're all associates on the research and evaluation team at CIS National. Today we're going to spend some time talking you through how to create and utilize a logic model to implement and analyze a program in your affiliate. The overall aim of this video is to ensure that participants understand the CIS theory of change and understand the purposes for creating and utilizing a logic model. Additionally, participants will be able to define and identify the key components of a logic model and locate resources for building your own logic model. We're going to kick off today's presentation by talking about a theory of change, which is similar to a logic model but has several notable differences. Whether or not it's formalized or specifically identified, every organization does operate under a theory of change. A theory of change is basically a roadmap for change. It provides organizations with a general framework for how they believe desired change will occur within a particular context. Generally, theories of change clarify how change happens and what it will take to get there. Some of you might be familiar with this graphic showing the CIS theory of change. This diagram shows our focused and intentional activities and practices, which include developing relationships with caring adults, developing social, emotional, and academic competencies, and improving attendance, behavior, and coursework. We believe these will ultimately guide us to our intended outcomes, to increase the number of students graduating from high school and ensure that students are equipped for college, career, and civic engagement after graduation. We hope that this diagram offers a clear depiction of how implementing the CIS model and delivering supports and interventions that are aligned with student needs will eventually contribute to positive outcomes for our students over the course of their lives. You can check out the NRC student support page for talking points that are aligned with this diagram. Now I'm going to turn it over to Betty, who's going to talk about some of the notable differences between logic models and the theory of change.
So you might see that theory of change and logic model as terms are used interchangeably. They're certainly connected, but as you'll learn today, a logic model is usually a visual representation of a theory of change. So for our purposes, there are a few distinctions that we want to make in what we mean by theory of change and logic model. So both theories of change and logic models can help explain how change will occur. However, an overall theory of change will give you an overarching, bigger picture idea of the work at a strategic level. A logic model might be more focused on how a program or an initiative will work, while a theory of change might take a step back, be a little bit more theoretical, and might reflect a broader scope. A logic model is more detailed and specific, and it's specifically used as a tool for planning and implementation. Thinking through and referring back to a logic model will give you a procedural pathway for the work that is to be done and the outcomes that will be measured throughout the process. And the logic model is also a living document that can and should be modified as the work develops and changes throughout the implementation process. It's important to note that both a theory of change and a logic model are key to organizational continuous learning and evaluation. With that, let's go into a little bit more detail as to why you should consider creating and utilizing a logic model. And in general, there are 3 reasons. Program design and planning. Logic models provide a visual tool for you as an opportunity to plan out the components of a program and then connect that to how and why a program might work. Program implementation. A logic model can be used to manage and monitor how the program is being implemented. The logic model can be adapted, as we mentioned, or modified in response to program implementation. Program evaluation and strategic reporting. Building a logic model actually creates an explicit link to program evaluation because a logic model shows the anticipated or expected outcomes of a program or initiative. So this means that the logic model can create an opportunity for internal continuous learning, external advocacy, and even as a tool for pursuing funding. With this in mind, CIS affiliates might consider utilizing a logic model when working on an initiative comprised of a set of programs, specific targeted or sometimes grant-funded programming, or local partnerships or coalitions. Good examples of this include the CIS Challenge Schools initiative, an affiliate-level initiative on data culture, or when an affiliate is collaborating on a community-level partnership on trauma-informed care. Now I'm going to turn it over to Eamon to explain the core components of a logic model.
Thank you, Betty. Let's talk a little bit more in detail now about what a logic model looks like. Logic models come in various formats. Some contain more components than others, and the labels used to describe the components may vary, as does the direction in which the logic model is presented. For instance, it could be left to right or top down. So keeping this flexibility in mind, logic models typically depict the relationships between the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes in a logical and reasonable sequence. Let's talk more in detail what each of these components mean. Inputs are the resources that are invested and available to implement the program or initiative. They are the resources needed for activities in order to meet desired objectives. Inputs help determine the extent to which the initiative can be implemented and desired outcome can be achieved. A list of resources and inputs can also be used to develop a budget for the initiative. Some examples of the inputs include human resources, so for instance, personnel with sufficient abilities and skills to implement the activities, money or funding needed to cover the cost of the activities, space or facilities needed to conduct the activities, any technology or equipment required in order to undertake activities, for example, computer hardware, software, printers, copiers, and any other supplies or materials needed for activities. These could be office supplies or training materials. Activities are the key actions carried out using the inputs to meet the desired objectives. Providing a complete list of activities helps people who are not familiar with your program or initiative to understand what it really takes to implement it. Some examples of activities include, for instance, revising and delivering a training to students, or developing and administering an assessment tool. So activities really are your program events. Outputs are the products and services that are delivered as a direct result of the activities. While the outputs help us evaluate how well we're implementing the initiatives, they are not the changes we expect the initiatives to achieve. They should, however, ultimately lead to desired outcomes. Outputs should be linked to specific activities and resources. Some examples of outputs could be number of students tutored and hours of tutoring services provided, number of professional development sessions conducted, topics covered, and number of school staff trained, any action plans developed, or it could be number of leadership team meetings held. Lastly, outcomes are specific, attainable, and measurable changes that we hope will take place as a result of our initiative or program. Outcomes are changes that are expected to occur over time in the short, medium, and long term as a result of the program's activities and outputs. Outcomes are often grouped according to the order in which we expect the results of the outputs to occur. Immediate or short-term outcomes result directly from the delivery of outputs. Intermediate or medium-term outcomes are the changes anticipated after immediate outcomes are achieved. And long-term outcomes are the furthest reaching changes that can reasonably be attributed to program after the immediate and intermediate outcomes have been achieved. An example of a short-term outcome could be an increase in awareness of a program among underrepresented demographic groups. An example of a medium-term outcome could be an increase in number of applicants from underrepresented demographic groups as a result of increase in awareness of the program. An example of a long-term outcome could be an increase in number of enrolled students from underrepresented demographic groups as a result of increased number of applicants. Now, Betty will talk about some of the other things you should consider when building your logic model.
So there are questions to consider as you build a logic model. Firstly, what are we trying to accomplish, and what are the goals and objectives? A goal is a broad and general statement about the intended outcomes of a program or initiative. And goals tend to be abstract in nature and hard to measure on their own, but they are essential for the development of more concrete and measurable objectives. And objectives are concrete and precise action statements that ultimately help you to achieve the goals and the changes that you want to bring about. Secondly, how will we know we have accomplished our goals? When we develop our objectives, we need to ask ourselves the following questions. What indicators will we look for to measure the progress or success of our initiative? Indicators will tell us when and if changes have occurred. And we need to ask ourselves what data are readily available to measure our progress and success. Do we need to develop new measures like surveys, assessments, and focus groups? And similarly, we need to ask who will be involved in the initiative or program and what the target population is. Who is the program or initiative intended for, and what human resources or partners are needed? Similarly, there are a few things to note when you're creating a logic model. Logic models might differ depending on the scope or context. You'll find very simple logic models when the program is very specific or has a limited scope, but you also might find significantly comprehensive logic models. You can either start at the beginning with inputs or at the end with outcomes with your logic model as you're planning, and you can create it backward or forward depending on what you know. Logic models are living documents, and as we said, it should be updated throughout implementation to reflect the programmatic adjustment. Generally, the four core components of a logic model are the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. But as Eamon mentioned, you might find other components reflected in a logic model. For an example, the goals for when you want to make a program or an initiative's goals explicit in the logic model. Assumptions, these are the things that you are assuming will be in place for the success of the program. So this can include things like the beliefs and behaviors of people involved, or that the resources and staffing will remain stable. External or contextual factors are aspects influencing the program or initiative that are usually outside of your control. So this includes things like the structure of a school district, the political environment, or a community culture. And impact. These are the broader, longer-term changes that you might expect or hope to occur, similar to the longer-term outcomes as Eamon mentioned. Some logic models will try to make this more explicit. And another thing to note is that logic models can be accompanied by a narrative explanation when it is helpful. And again, this all depends on the scope of a program or initiative and the anticipated outcomes. Logic models are flexible and should ultimately be useful tools. Now I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to share this example of a logic model.
Thanks, Betty. So now that you're all familiar with the components of a logic model and particular things to note as you're working through the logic modeling process, we thought it might be helpful to share an example that illustrates the level of detail that can be included in a logic model. This particular example here is from a guide to logic modeling that was created by the CDC's Division for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention. Reading from left to right, you can see that the model explicitly names the resources that will be used to implement the chronic care model and the specific activities that will take place. The creators of this logic model chose to outline very detailed outcomes, including short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. The benefit of this level of information is that you can see they have multiple checkpoints in which they will determine whether or not their model is reaching the intended outcomes. And this really speaks to the ability of a model to be a living document. So they can check in with these checkpoints, see if they're not reaching their intended goals and outcomes, and then tweak the activities as they need to. The creators of this model also chose to include assumptions and contextual factors to deepen the overall understanding of external variables that could influence the outcomes of the chronic care model. So you can see here that one of their assumptions is that the patients involved in their model will maintain their blood pressure control. They also list contextual factors, which here you can see is the prevalence of risk factors and hypertension increasing. And this is a great example of something that is out of control of the creators for this model. This model is overall an excellent example of the detail you can capture within a logic model to ensure that you're considering all the resources, contextual factors, activities, and outcomes that will drive your model forward. If you'd like to access the example logic model that I just showed from the CDC, along with other helpful resources such as a brief YouTube video, the CDC's Guide to Logic Modeling, some information from the Pell Institute, and more, please check out the Student Supports page of the NRC. Remember that the password to access the NRC is Empower in all lowercase. You can go to resources.communitiesandschools.org, click on the Student Support/Model Materials icon depicted here, and look for the Logic Modeling section towards the top of the page. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch our video today. We hope that it was helpful, and good luck in your logic modeling process.